Okay, Surf and Destroy. The presentation really isn't, I'm not going to go into any huge detail on how surf works. This presentation is more about the logistics and the problems raised by managing complex tracking studies and how Askia really kind of came through and helped us on this particular study. Excellent. So a little bit about the company. We established in summer of last year. This conference is actually our first event. I'm not going to waffle on about what we do. Jerome's already alluded to the software development side of the company. Really our specialism is in working with complex data sets and doing, I think the people we work with will testify that, you know, we work with fairly cranky data sometimes and have a variety of tools we use in order to affect that. That's the website. It launches today. We've kept everything fairly quiet because we've been pretty flat out since the 1st of September last year. And just to add furthermore, the project that I'm discussing here, I actually started work on prior to the formation of W3DL. So, askiasurf, I was first shown surf in the summer of 2008, and my initial attitude towards it as someone who works with complex data is that, you know, I already do this. This is what my job is as a data processor. I work with different shaped data sets and bring them all together. So I already do this, which, thinking about it, it's a very similar attitude that I used to face in the late 90s with management consultants who worked in the insurance markets, who would constantly ask us for survey data in Excel format, because when we showed them market research tables, they would just say, well, these are just pivot tables. And 4 weeks later, they would come back and say, can we have some of those nice market research tables you do, because we can't get any sense out of this using Excel. So, as I say, anyone with 5+ years of experience of complex analysis has probably had to do the task that Surf does anyway. And so it's kind of unnecessary additional cost. And amusingly, I also helped develop some similar software around 10 years ago. And I was actually sat at an ASC conference with Jerome as this was being presented, and Jerome handily turned around to me and said, you know, you could do something like this. And I replied, well, yes, I helped write the one we're looking at on the screen at the moment. So tracking studies for beginners, very often it's a huge investment by clients. Therefore, it's a massive time investment by those people who are running it. If they're well run, there's solid turnover for the company. They're very heavily checked, and because they're regular, we can have high confidence in them. And if you run them intelligently, you can constantly develop new products on them, which ties the client into your company. Good news all around. Badly run, instead of turning over money, you turn over staff, you swallow resources into them, and you get this idea that they're constantly on fire. You know, they swallow resources and you're just constantly firefighting stuff. And as you put one wave to bed, the next wave begins, and hey presto, it's all on fire again. So we're all run around and panic for a few weeks. And they present management nightmares as well. You've got to cope with changes in the survey. I think we've all had to deal with weird arbitrary question renumbering in a Word document without trying to explain to a researcher that actually changing all the names of the variables means we've got to change it all in the scripts, and this is going to be months and months of work. Coping with errors, quite often on tracking studies, an error may appear a few months in. How do you deal with that? Do you go back to the client? Do you go to the client's client? And you also have to cope with changes in software, which really all of these 3 points form the basis of this presentation. We've already heard from Tim and Rahan this morning about the systems they use at Network Research. So a quick word of caution. If you use Askia in a SQL implementation, a lot of surf is irrelevant, because if you've got a tracking study, it's one KES that lives in SQL, and you just add to it month on month. It's a very, very robust way of working. But it's still, this presentation still could be of interest to you if you're using that kind of implementation of Askia, because you may want to merge in data from other agencies from abroad. So, perfect study came along, I thought, to trial surf with. The client in question was new to Askia. They're a medium-sized full-service agency and they specialise in ad research. All of the researchers have Askia analyses on their desktops and they now require delivery of KESs instead of delivery of tables. They had an existing tracking study with 19 waves of data, and the data collection agency that they were using was using software that I knew was SSS compliant, so this all seemed very, very straightforward. And if you're not aware of SSS, I'd urge you to go and have a look at it. It's a metadata standard that allows us to take data out of one package and into another. It's really one of the cornerstones of our business. The client was satisfied with the method I put forward and the use of askiasurf. Well, why wouldn't they be happy? At the end of the day, they get a deliverable that they can open in an analyse, and the entire historical survey is in there. And there was a fairly low time pressure. The client had 6 months to kind of run this particular survey in parallel. So we had plenty of time to make sure that the data was correct and we could turn off one system and move over to Askia. So, happy days, I thought. This should all be relatively plain sailing. The existing study was delivered to the clients as SPSS SAV files on a monthly basis. And Product X, I won't actually name it, had really good kind of brand coding abilities. And this was a web survey that checked advertising and checked brand awareness. And what you can do in this software is actually set up kind of brand dictionaries. So instead of Askia, you can also have Askia, and various different spellings. And with some of the brands in here, I think we're up to about 200 different alternate spellings. So the actual reporting that was being done was very kind of tracking, rolling averages on awareness and ad recall. And the majority of reporting was done in Excel that was generated straight from this application. The main focus at the outset of the job was on the ad hoc monthly sections that described a particular ad campaign. So the fact that they were just looking at one wave in isolation all the time and then exporting aggregated figures to Excel wasn't really an issue. However, the client did want to develop both the project and the relationship with the client, so they knew that they needed to use a more powerful tool. Happy days? Well, not quite, because when I went to the data collection agency, they had this rather quirky way of delivering the data. They're an online agency, and they export the data, which they could go out to SSS, thereby honouring all the standard kind of market research formats, but instead they go out to SPSS SAV. They then run all these data checks and cleanings, and quite a lot of the time they overquote us, they take out any surplus respondents, and so the deliverable that actually ends up with my client is another SAV file. I thought this would be fairly straightforward. We would go back to them and say, well, look, can we just get all the data that you've delivered to the client delivered as SSS, and we can just load this straight into KES files, organise them all with surf. So, although they had the data in the archive, what we started to find that there'd been a number of staff changes at this agency, and on a monthly basis they would do kind of quick and dirty changes. Sometimes they would go into the data file and remove a couple of records manually. And the manager there made it fairly clear to me that trying to replicate and get all this data out would be extremely problematic. They didn't have any particular budget time or resource to do this, and they'd already delivered the data to the client, so really they had no obligation. So, back to the client. We have a problem, and we needed to discuss alternatives with them. Now, fortunately, the desktop package they were using at the time also supported SSS, so we had another route. Happy days again, possibly. We also needed to look closely at this application because in taking it over to Askia, the excellent brand coding facilities that this package had to be recreated in Visual Basic. This was the only kind of deal breaker in the operation. And given all the political concerns of the jobs and the toing and froing between all the agencies, the Visual Basic programming was some of the easiest aspects of this. So we decided to get our exports from that package. Solution there seemed more robust as we'd also be showing exactly the same data that this agency had delivered to their clients. So we should get 100% agreement between all the figures. Big problem was this was all SPSS data, so there were no multiple variables at all. So we were now dealing with 19 waves of 1,400 separate variables. And SPSS generally is a bit of a hobby horse of mine, because especially a lot of the online solutions we see coming out of the States, the only thing they'll deliver the data to you in is SPSS subformat. Now, multiple variables are now supported in there, but it's a little known feature of SPSS, and it's not widely supported by anyone else who implements imports and exports from SPSS. So we had a lot of long brand lists, and instead of having a multi-mention 102 item list with 100 brands and a couple of reject categories, we now had 100 separate single variables with answered, not answered, question skipped, sys missing, and don't know. So we now had 100 variables with 5 categories instead of 1 variable with 100 mentions. More bad news. The SSS wasn't even remotely compliant out of this desktop package. So we had to have a big chat with them, the developers at this software company, and again, they're under no obligation to do this, but my client at this agency made noises about not renewing the license, added a bit more pressure, and because of that, we got involved and started talking to this particular software about the SSS issues, and after about 3 or 4 weeks, and use of the first beta version of the SSS online validation tool that's just been unveiled a couple of weeks ago, we managed to get some decent SSS out of this package. So finally, 2 or 3 months into this process, we actually had some bloody data, so we could start building the job properly. So, to the land of askiasurf. Basically, askiasurf was really the kind of calm, zen product at the middle of all of this, because it's incredibly easy to use. Basically, the way that it works is you load in your first wave of data, your first KES, if you like, becomes your campaign, onto which you layer all your other waves or all your different countries, and as you add in the next wave, there's a lot of intelligence in there that matches up questions between waves, and you carry on in a similar fashion. As new questions come on, if they haven't appeared in previous waves, you create a new campaign question, and it's fully editable. It's really very powerful, and I think within about half a day, all my cynicism about, well, I already do this, was completely evaporated, because I thought, well, I don't do it anywhere near as elegantly or as quickly as this package is doing it. And obviously we don't do the matching in there using this kind of strange Venn diagram stuff. It's all done through a nice user interface here, which I will now show you in a bit more detail. This is the main kind of interface into Surf, and what you do when you load a job in is you create one of these wave instances over here in the campaign tree, and then as you add your data in, you create one of these folder objects underneath, and as you go through what askiasurf refers to as the reconciliation, what you then see is a very good visual indicator of how the questions are matching up to the previous wave. Anything that comes up white, that's a perfect match, and that means it's matching on all criteria: name, number of answers, all the other kind of inbuilt special features that Askia has in terms of classifying questions. The yellow stuff means, well, it's made a match, but you're going to need to go back and have a look at this because there are slight differences in here. And what you do is, when you're looking at this, on the left-hand side here, you have your campaign questions and responses, and on the right-hand side, you have the source, which is the wave you're bringing in, and this is how you match everything up through the dialogues. It's very, very intuitive to use. There's a lot of right-click functionality in there that will bring up menus. I mean, absolutely the only criticism I would have of this, which I think is going to be implemented soon, is that what I'd really like to see is the title text of the question from both the campaign and the source coming up, which is really quite invaluable when you're trying to match variables that have changed name. So in operation, it's got incredibly thorough matching routines, and the reconciliation report that you're delivered at the end of the process is absolute megabytes of information about how the matching process has gone. If anything, the only aspect of askiasurf that's a bit overwhelming is how comprehensive the matching process is. But one of the big advantages is most of this can be configured and you can tune it higher or lower, whether you or not you want to look at things like maximum and minimum values on number variables. And this was hilarious because I wrote this as an ultra-stable application. I think in something like 15 months of using it, I experienced one crash until I started writing this presentation and had to go back and do some screenshots, and where I've upgraded to 5.2, suddenly the thing fell over, and this was over last weekend, so I was in a complete mither over this. But again, with Askia support, got in contact with James, all sorted out within an hour and a half. So it's very visual as well. As I showed you in the last frame, one of the things we do when we're building user interfaces is try and use colour wherever possible. If you can put a visual aspect in there, using your eyes instead of just referring to black and white text is just makes everything that much more intuitive. And the documentation is just excellent. It's very clear and it's very data focused. If you've worked in analysis or data prep for a number of years, there's nothing in there that's going to faze you. Anyway, back to the deadly tracking study. Even more bad news, just classic tracking issues really. Once we got up to wave 7, pretty much every variable in the survey was renamed and renumbered, and obviously that's going to affect the reconciliation greatly. The code frames and the brand lists changed too. Now, this wasn't trivial because some of the brand lists in this particular job are 200, 300 items long. So if you suddenly reorganise that, and considering the volume of data we pumped in, I mean, talking to James about this, he's pretty sure that this is the biggest study that's ever been put into surf thus far. So, and then even crazier, we seem to go through this flip-flop phase around wave 8, wave 9, where they decided that they didn't like these new variable names, so we're going to go back and rename them all to what they were 2 waves ago. Now, askiasurf's good, but it's not going to really be good if it's dealing with kind of that kind of irrational flip-flopping in the authoring of the questionnaire. So what we needed to do was adopt a kind of diagnostic or detective approach to the data as well, because just relying on the names and the labelling, and given the kind of flakiness of the data collection agency, the whole process got that much more drawn out because we had to make sure that the distributions in the actual questions we were looking at were similar. So it became a much more timely process than I'd originally anticipated. You know, this project was supposed to test out askiasurf, but unfortunately, this wasn't really a test anymore. It was becoming more of an inquisition. And as we all know in the UK, no one expects an inquisition. So, the difference with Askia, we've already spoken a lot about the open architecture that's employed by Askia, but they are genuinely client-driven applications. As Jerome said in the introduction, I used to be IT and DP manager at RSM, who were Askia's first UK clients. And the change in the applications from kind of 2001, 2002 through to now is really nothing short of remarkable. Every time a new release comes out, I click in and see what's in there because the functionality that's introduced is always done by other clients asking for it, and they're always very kind of research-focused developments. They're very, very responsive to suggestions. In one of the first meetings I had with Jerome all those years ago, we put forward a bulleted list of something like 30 suggestions. We revisited it 2 months later. Of those 30 suggestions, only one thing hadn't been implemented. And when we sat down and met and discussed it afterwards, of the 29 that had been done, about 20 of them had gone wildly beyond what we were actually asking for and what we'd expected. And they're very cooperative in problem solving, which I think would be most people's experience of them in here. And one of the big refreshing things, which Tim alluded to in his talk, is that there's no real kind of black boxes. Obviously, they're not going to give you the program code for analyze or design or anything like that. But if you ask a question about the structure of the databases, you'll always get a straight answer back. And if you're trying to develop on top of that, that's really important. Having worked with other software providers who purport to use open databases, it's just not the same thing. So it's a very open system and it's a very open mindset. And now in terms of Redmine, I think what they're doing is revolutionary. There are no secrets. If there's a problem in the software, not only you know about it, but everyone else in the Askia family knows about it. This is really radical, and the guys are to be commended over this, really. And interestingly, some information, obviously, where so many features are being introduced, isn't actually in the documentation, and sometimes you come up with stuff that even the guys at Askia aren't even aware happens. So, life-saving time, as going back to the tracking study once again, with the changes, one of the problems in doing the reconciliations is in the early versions of SURF, it only remembered the last wave. So if question 2 changed to question 3, at the next wave, it would be expecting question 3. It's not expecting it to revert back to question 2. And as you can imagine, with kind of 1,400 variables in each wave, I started to get very clammy about each wave is going to take me the best part of the day to reconcile, because it's all manually dragged and dropped, and I can't rely on it. But again, in a really good example of how Askia want you to work with them, I approached James and said, well, look, is there any chance of adding some other fields in this database to do a kind of memory against the variables in the campaign? So instead of just looking at the last wave, it would go back across all historic waves to see, well, question 3 in the campaign has been known under these 7 or 8 different question names, and we'll add that into the matching process. So as a result of that, we had a long discussion, and then suddenly this feature was built into the reconciliation screen. And I mean, this one option, which I think took James a day to develop, probably saved me something like 2 man-weeks in running this study. So life-saving, well, not really. It's kind of health and safety always with Askia. Because of the open architecture, it's really easy to get data in and out of the software. And that's one of the prime reasons we put Askia at the heart of what we're doing at We Work With Data. It's got the best SSS XML2 implementation I've seen in terms of honouring SSS on the way in and forming really good metadata on the way out. Various companies use different approaches with the XML side of SSS, but very good with Askia. And XML is also being used in many other useful places. The analysed portfolios are saved as XML files. The ASCII data maps, if you ever export data out of tools, they're also XML documents. And if you've got any experience of working with XML data and are used to doing things like style sheet translations on them, it means, again, we can express how we work with Askia and speed things up greatly. And as I say, it's very easy to get data out, load it into Excel or into even things like plain text editors, run processor over it, and then reload. And this means that the best tools can always be selected for the work, but more commonly than not these days, certainly wasn't the case 7 or 8 years ago, but most of the time I just leave data in Askia these days because the tools are all there to do everything that I need to do. But again, with the open mindset, there's no paranoia with the guys at Askia if you use other software. Their attitude is more, why are you using the other software? Tell us what it does, and we'll build this into future releases. So are the seas now calm on this? Well, we're now at wave 29 of this tracking study. And as I mentioned earlier on, there is a hidden feature in SURF that I wasn't aware of, and I thought because of the open architecture again, it's very easy to get stuff in and out. And what I discovered is if you open a QEW up in Analyze, you can then use the export questions from Analyze to form a new standalone KES file. What this means is getting it out into a single standalone KES. You can take the most complex tracking study, get it out to a single KES file, and then export it out to anything that tools will export to. So what we did after 24 months of this particular study is we tidied up all the redundant SPSS variables, and we just created a single KES file for the whole of 2008 and 2009, with all the months in 2010 onwards being added in as new extra waves. So the variables are consolidated now. It's much smaller. the study, when we were hitting certain issues earlier on, and I had to send this into Askia, I think it got up to something like 70 megabytes in total, and we'd have to FTP, and this was zipped up as well. I had to send the entire project to James on Monday, and having gone through this stage, the whole thing zips up to 9 megabytes now. Exactly the same study, all the data inside, just very, very efficient. And we still face data issues with the same field agency being used. We have duplicate variables delivered in the data. We have just random from one month to another. The sequence of the variables is utterly different. But askiasurf, again, because the variable matching and the memory of variable names is so robust, it just absolutely kills this as it comes in. So to summarise, I use Surf, and I'd certainly recommend Surf to any kind of Askia users, even non-Askia users who want to try and tame a big, complicated tracking study. So tracking studies and beyond, really, there was, in my experience, there was a hell of a lot more tracking done years ago, because this was prior to kind of loyalty card data and stuff like that. So market research would actually give you kind of audit information as well. Now with store cards, we're kind of being attacked a little, I think, as an industry from this. But what we've got to do is kind of think about what we do best. And for me, what makes market research data special is it's about people's attitudes. It's what they think. And although store cards will record what their weekly purchases are, they won't tell you why they choose Kellogg's cornflakes instead of the store's own cornflakes. And we now have a wealth of behavioural data. We have weblogs, we have purchase data, and something we've done with a few clients lately is on ad tests, actually start importing in metadata about the actual ad campaigns in. And we're getting some really quite radical results by doing that. So I think in terms of the future, it's all going to be about building these new complex data sets that still use market research data, but start bringing in other aspects of behavioural data. We've been doing this for years with geodemographics and stuff like this, but I think this is the real opportunity. And obviously, I think as part of this new approach, and I think some of the papers here this morning are showing that people are already doing this, is I think we've got to pay respondents a little bit more respect. There's a real cynicism to market research amongst the general public now, and I think it's slightly a product of kind of online surveys where you'll have pop-ups, overlays, and it's bad research as well. There was a feature in Research's Online magazine a couple of weeks ago, which moaned about radio buttons and how hard they were to tick. And we've had a survey the other week with something like 30 or 40 scale questions. And rather than actually address, well, why are you asking all these irrelevant scale questions, asking people to score every minute detail of their life out of 10, we're concentrating on the way that they're actually doing it. And I think, less is more. Let's start focusing in on the information that we actually want to ask people, instead of adopting a kind of kid in a sweet shop approach of let's just ask the respondent every single question we can possibly think of. I discussed this with a colleague last year, and he said the danger if we don't start addressing this soon is the only people who take part in market research will be the bored and the stupid. People whose boredom threshold is so high that they're willing to sit there for 40 minutes and answer 200 scale questions, or people who are just a bit stupid and aren't really bothered about their time being wasted. So, another approach we can do here is actually use data that's already known. We've been doing this for years in terms of CATI sample, of bringing in information about customers, but given the widespread use of customer databases, when we bring sampling to CATI jobs, how much more information has the client got that we can bring in that shortens that interview process? Similarly, going forward, there needs to be more of a database approach to both data collection and analysis, instead of simple respondent-based data sets. And paradata, which gets talked about greatly at conferences. And again, This is data that's collected in conjunction with the interview, how long people take to answer questions. And I think with the development of so many interesting flash tools in online surveys now, if we really use these carefully, we can start thinking about the simple kind of flash tool where you lay out brands on a supermarket shelf. It's not the order in which they finally arrive at. What were the brands they picked up and put down? What were the brands that weren't touched? If we start using common flash objects and build analysis libraries of common techniques over these, we can shorten the respondent interview and get that much more out of it at the back end. In closing, I think to get to the future, we do need more relational database data in market research, and Askia offers that. They're not just one-table databases or black boxes as we see from some of the competitors. And so therefore, I think Askia is very much part of this future. But in approaching this future, where are we going to find the people who stitch together complex data sets and taking it in external data, reformat data? Well, we work with data for you. So, thanks for listening, and I'll take questions after.